Long before PlayStation and Xbox battled for supremacy, another console rivalry captivated gamers across the world. The year was 1988, and video games were dominated by one company, Nintendo. With its NES holding a staggering 95% market share, the company seemed untouchable. But a challenger was about to emerge from Japan, featuring a sleek black design and a bold new identity, the Sega Genesis, a machine that would not only compete with Nintendo, but fundamentally change how video games were marketed to the public.
Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
Welcome to the next level.
By the early 80s, Sega was one of the top 5 arcade game manufacturers in the United States, with revenues exceeding $200 million during the early 80s. However, soon enough, the arcade industry took a serious downturn, leading Gulf and Western, Sega's parent company at the time, to sell off its North American arcade manufacturing organization and licensing rights. So Sega dived into the gaming console market with their first serious attempt, with the release of the SG-1000 in Japan in 1983. While it sold a respectable 160,000 units, its launch was overshadowed by Nintendo's Famicom, which was released on the same day and quickly outpaced the SG-1000 by a 10-to-1 margin. Sega followed up with the Mark II and later Mark III, which was later redesigned and released in the US as the Master System in 1986. Despite being technically superior to the NES, the Master System struggled to gain traction. Nintendo's dominance seemed insurmountable. But Sega's console R&D team, led by Masami Ishikawa and supervised by Hideki Sato, wasn't ready to concede defeat. Almost immediately after the Master System's launch, they began work on a successor, one that would harness the power of 16-bit technology. In 1987, Sega faced new competition when NEC released the PC engine known as the TurboGrafx-16 in North America, to considerable fanfare in Japan. To remain competitive against both Nintendo and NEC, Ishikawa's team decided to incorporate a 16-bit microprocessor into their new system. They turned to Sega's strengths in the arcade industry, adapting the successful Sega System 16 arcade board architecture for home use. The console's appearance was crafted by a team led by Mitsushige Shiraiwa, who drew inspiration from high-end audio equipment and automobiles. Shiraiwa noted that this more sophisticated look helped target the Mega Drive to a broader age range, unlike the Famicom, which primarily appealed to children. According to Hideki Sato, the Japanese design for the Mega Drive featured 16-bit embossed in golden metallic veneer to create an impression of power and technological advancement. The console was initially announced in the June 1988 issue of the Japanese gaming magazine Beep as the Mark V, but Sega management wanted a stronger name. After reviewing more than 300 proposals, they settled on Mega Drive. For the North American release, Sega executive David Rosen insisted on changing the name to Genesis, seeing it as representative of a new beginning for the company. Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan on October 29, 1988, though the launch was overshadowed by Nintendo's release of Super Mario Bros. 3 just a week earlier. Despite positive coverage from influential magazines such as Famitsu and Beep, which helped establish a following, Sega only managed to ship 400,000 units in the first year. To boost sales, the company released various peripherals and games, including an online banking system and answering machine called the Sega Mega Answer. Nevertheless, the Mega Drive struggled to overtake the venerable Famicom, and remained a distant third in Japan behind Nintendo's Super Famicom and NEC's PC Engine throughout the 16-bit era. At the time, Sega did not possess a North American sales and marketing organization, and was distributing its Master System through Tonka. Dissatisfied with Tonka's performance, Sega looked for a new partner to market the Genesis in North America, and offered the rights to Atari Corporation, which did not yet have a 16-bit system. But Tramiel declined to acquire the new console, deeming it too expensive, and instead opted to focus on the Atari ST computer line. This rejection forced Sega to establish its own North American subsidiary, Sega of America, to handle the Genesis launch. The console officially debuted in September 1989. The initial price point was set at approximately $189.99, positioning it as a premium gaming experience compared to the aging NES. Launch titles included Space Harrier 2, Ghouls and Ghosts, Golden Axe, Super Thunder Blade, and The Revenge of Shinobi, with Altered Beast bundled with the console. Between July and August 1990, Virgin Mastertronic initially ordered 20,000 Mega Drive units, but had to increase this number twice due to unexpectedly high demand, eventually placing orders for 40,000 units for the UK market alone by the end of the year. The technical specifications of the final product were impressive for the time. The main microprocessor was a 16-bit Motorola 68000 CPU clocked at 7.6 MHz. An 8-bit Zilog Z80 processor controlled the sound hardware and provided backward compatibility with Master System games. The Genesis boasted 64 kilobytes of RAM, 64 kilobytes of video RAM, and 8 kilobytes of audio RAM. It could display up to 61 colors at once, from a palette of 512, and its games came in ROM cartridge format inserted at the top of the console. Sound production was handled by a Texas Instruments programmable sound generator integrated with the video display processor and a Yamaha FM synthesizer chip. The Z80 processor primarily controlled both sound chips to produce stereo music and sound effects. For the North American market, new Sega of America CEO Michael Katz instituted a two-part approach to build sales. The first part involved a marketing campaign to challenge Nintendo head-on and emphasize the more arcade-like experience available on the Genesis, with slogans including the now iconic "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." Since Nintendo owned the console rights to most arcade games of the time, the second part of Katz's strategy involved creating a library of recognizable games using the names and likenesses of celebrities and athletes, resulting in titles such as Pat Riley Basketball, Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, Mario Lemieux Hockey, and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Despite these efforts, Sega struggled to overcome Nintendo's dominant presence in consumers' homes. Tasked by Nakayama to sell 1 million units within the first year, Katz and Sega of America sold only 500,000. At the Winter CES in January 1990, the Sega Genesis demonstrated a strong lineup of games that received positive reception for approaching arcade-quality graphics and gameplay, as well as for providing non-arcade experiences such as Phantasy Star 2. However, breaking Nintendo's market dominance would require more drastic measures and an even more aggressive marketing approach. In mid-90s, Nakayama made a pivotal decision that would dramatically alter Sega's trajectory in the console market. He hired Tom Kalinske to replace Katz as CEO of Sega of America. Although Kalinske knew little about the video game market, he surrounded himself with industry-savvy advisors and quickly developed a comprehensive four-point plan. Cut the price of the console, create an American team to develop games targeted specifically at the American market, expand the aggressive advertising campaigns that Katz had initiated, and replace the bundled game Altered Beast with a new title, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Japanese board initially opposed the plan to cut the console's price and bundle its top game, fearing lost profits. During a tense meeting, Nakayama, frustrated by the pushback, kicked over a chair and declared, "I hired this guy to make decisions for Europe and the Americas. Let him do it." This moment proved pivotal. Critics soon praised Sonic the Hedgehog as one of the greatest games yet made, and Genesis sales surged as customers who had been waiting for Super Nintendo decided to purchase a Genesis instead. While the SNES debuted against an established competitor, NEC's TurboGrafx 16 failed to gain traction and soon exited the market. In large part due to the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Genesis outsold the SNES in the United States nearly 2-1 during the 1991 holiday season. By January 1992, Sega controlled 65% of the 16-bit console market, marking the first time Nintendo had not been the console leader since 1985. The creation of Sonic the Hedgehog represented Sega's conscious effort to develop a mascot that could compete with Nintendo's Mario franchise. The winning design, by Naoto Oshima, was a sleek blue hedgehog with red and white shoes, inspired by Michael Jackson. Sonic's attitude, speed, and visual design were consciously engineered to contrast with Mario's plump, cartoonish charm. Where Mario was slow, cute, and approachable, Sonic was fast, edgy, and cool, a rebellious teen icon. Tailor-made for the adolescent market Sega wanted to conquer.
Why can't it be more like that nice boy Mario? Oh! Little brat!
Sonic was more than a character. He was the embodiment of Sega Genesis's vision. His speed represented the technical power and processing advantage of the Genesis over the Super Nintendo. His bold design and cool demeanor mirrored Sega's aggressive marketing strategy, which pitched Genesis as the console for a new generation of gamers. Teens and young adults who were aging out of Nintendo's child-friendly image. The Genesis continued its momentum, outselling the SNES for 4 consecutive Christmas seasons from '91 to '94. This success stemmed from the console's 2-year head start, lower price point, and larger game library. The Genesis boasted 250 games versus only 75 for the Super Nintendo, though limited retail shelf space meant stores typically offered 100 Genesis and 50 Super Nintendo games at any given time. With the Genesis often outselling the Super Nintendo at a ratio of 2-to-1, Nintendo and Sega engaged in aggressive market positioning and occasionally misleading claims. Nintendo claimed it had sold more consoles in 1991 than it actually had, and forecasted it would sell 6 million consoles by the end of 1992, though its actual US install base at that time was just over 4 million units. These tactics made it difficult to determine a clear market leader for several years, with Nintendo's dollar share of the US 16-bit market declining from 60% at the end of 1992 to 37% by the end of 1993, while Sega claimed 55% of all 16-bit hardware sales during 1994. In addition to innovative marketing, Sega adopted a more open approach to third-party development compared to Nintendo's restrictive policies. However, the company still maintained tight control over the approval process for third-party games and charged high prices for cartridge manufacturing. This led to tensions with American publishers like Electronic Arts, who sought more favorable terms. In 1989, EA secretly started reverse engineering the Genesis to avoid Sega's strict licensing rules. They set up a secure room called Chernobyl, where one engineer studied the hardware and created his own documentation in about a month. EA's lawyers made sure it was all original and safe to use before sharing it with developers. The confrontation came to a head the day before the 1990 CES, when EA founder Trip Hawkins informed Nakayama that EA had the capability to run its own licensing program if Sega refused to meet its demands for more favorable terms. Faced with the prospect of a public relations disaster, Sega relented, and EA's upcoming Genesis games were showcased at CES the next day. In June 1990, EA signed what Hawkins described as a very unusual and much more enlightened license agreement with Sega that gave EA the right to produce as many titles as it wanted, approve its own titles, and enjoy more reasonable royalty rates and greater control over manufacturing. This partnership proved highly beneficial for both companies. EA released its first Genesis games, Populous and Budokan, The Martial Spirit, within the month. The first Genesis version of John Madden Football arrived before the end of 1990 and became what EA executive Bing Gordon called a killer app for the system. EA's sports titles would become critical to the Genesis's success, with Trip Hawkins noting that the faster drawing speed of the Genesis made it more suitable for sports games than the SNES. As Sega gained ground in the console market, it also drew more legal attention. After the Genesis launched in '89, game publisher Accolade wanted to bring some of its PC games to the system. But Sega's licensing was pricey and restrictive, so Accolade found a workaround. They bought a Genesis, reverse-engineered a few games, and figured out how to bypass the system's lockouts. That let them release Ishido, The Way of Stones, in 1990 without Sega's approval. To crack down on unlicensed games, Sega added a new security feature called the TMSS in the updated Genesis. It checked for the word Sega in a game's code, and if it found it, the console would show a message saying the game was licensed by Sega, even if it wasn't. This set the stage for legal drama. At CES in 1991, Accolade learned about the TMSS and added the right code to a few more games like Hardball and Star Control. Sega sued them for trademark and copyright infringement. Accolade hit back, arguing that Sega was the one causing confusion by forcing its name to appear. Sega won the first round in court, but Accolade appealed, and in 1992, they won. The court said Accolade's reverse engineering was fair use and blamed Sega's TMSS for the trademark issue. The company settled in 1993, and Accolade officially became a Sega licensee. In the early 90s, Sega was on a roll, but it soon found itself at the center of a major controversy that would reshape gaming. By 1993, the media started focusing on violent and mature content in video games, especially games like Night Trap, which used real actors and got called out in the UK Parliament. Sega's reputation for being edgy just made the spotlight even brighter. At the same time, Mortal Kombat hit home consoles and caused a stir for its graphic violence. Nintendo toned it down on the SNES, removing blood and softening the brutal fatalities, while Sega took a bold step. It introduced the first US game rating system, the Video Game Rating Council. This let them release a censored version of Mortal Kombat, with an MA-13 rating, but savvy players could unlock the original gore using a secret blood code. The SNES version, which had no rating and no blood, didn't stand a chance. Genesis outsold it by a huge margin. Afterwards, even Nintendo eased up on censorship, releasing Mortal Kombat 2 on the SNES completely uncensored. As Sega continued to push boundaries, it expanded the Genesis ecosystem with two significant add-ons. The first was the Sega CD. Priced at $299, the Sega CD upgraded the graphics and sound capabilities by adding a second, more powerful processor, more system memory, and hardware-based scaling and rotation similar to that found in Sega's arcade games. It also provided battery-backed storage RAM for saving game progress. Shortly after its North American launch, Sega began bundling the Sega CD with Sewer Shark, an FMV game developed by Digital Pictures. The Sega Genesis Model 2, released in 1994, was a streamlined redesign of the original console. It was smaller, lighter, and more affordable, with a simplified look and the removal of features like the headphone jack and volume slider. It maintained compatibility with most Genesis games and add-ons. Sega redesigned the Sega CD to match the new, slimmer form factor of the Genesis 2. Despite selling 2.24 million units worldwide, the Sega CD failed to meet Sega's expectations in Japan, selling only 100,000 units in its first year, due to a limited software library at launch. The second major add-on was the Sega 32X, released in November 1994. Developed as a stopgap to bridge the gap between the Genesis and the upcoming Sega Saturn, the 32X was a cartridge-based peripheral that plugged into the Genesis and provided improved graphics processing with two 32-bit Super H2 processors. The 32X faced significant challenges from the start. Before it could launch, Sega announced that the Saturn would be released in Japan in November 1994, coinciding with the 32X's target launch date in North America. This created confusion in the market as Sega of America was now trying to market the 32X as a transitional device between the Genesis and Saturn. Despite initial high demand, with more than 1 million orders placed for 32X units, Sega only managed to ship 600,000 units by January 1995. Priced at $159.99, the 32X was positioned as an inexpensive entry into 32-bit gaming, but developers were reluctant to create games for the add-on, given the imminent release of the Saturn. By early 1996, Sega discontinued the 32X to focus on the Saturn, with prices for the add-on dropping as low as $19.95 to clear inventory. Sega also produced the Genesis CDX, known as the Multi-Mega in Europe, a combined semi-portable Genesis Sega CD unit retailing for $399.95. The CDX was bundled with Sonic CD, Sega Classics Arcade Collection, and the Sega CD version of Echo the Dolphin. It featured a small LCD screen that displayed the current track when playing audio CDs, and its lightweight design allowed Sega to market it partly as a portable CD player. Late in the 16-bit era, Sega released the Genesis Nomad, a handheld version of the Genesis based on the Megajet, a portable unit featured on airplane flights in Japan. The Nomad operated on 6 AA batteries, displayed graphics on a 3.25-inch LCD screen, and supported the entire Genesis library except for games requiring the reset button. Third-party companies also created licensed variations of the Genesis. JVC released the Wonder Mega in Japan in April 1992, later redesigned and released as the XI in North America in September 1994. Pioneer's Laser Active required an add-on called the Mega LD Pack to play Genesis and Sega CD games. After the Genesis was discontinued, Majesco Entertainment released the Genesis 3 as a budget version in 1998. This smaller console could only play standard cartridges as it omitted support for the Sega CD and 32X. By the mid-1990s, the video game industry was transitioning to the 32-bit era with the launch of the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Despite this, sales of 16-bit hardware and software continued to account for 64% of the video game market in 1995. Sega underestimated the continued popularity of the Genesis and did not have sufficient inventory to meet demand. Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske noted that they could have sold another 300,000 Genesis systems in the November-December timeframe of 1995. Nakayama's decision to focus on the Saturn, based on the system's relative performance in Japan, contributed to this miscalculation. In contrast, Nintendo concentrated on the 16-bit home console market and its successful Game Boy handheld, capturing 42% of the video game market dollar share without launching a 32-bit console. By the end of its run, Sega had sold 30.75 million Genesis units worldwide, with some sources claiming figures as high as 40 million. Regional sales included 3.58 million in Japan, approximately 8 million in Europe, and 18 million in the United States. The console's library of over 900 games continues to be celebrated for its diversity and quality. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 pushed platforming to new speeds with loop-de-loops, split-screen co-op, and the debut of Tails. Streets of Rage 2 delivered hard-hitting beat-em-up action, letting players clean up the streets with unique characters and one of the most iconic soundtracks in gaming history. Gunstar Heroes, developed by Treasure, offered frantic run-and-gun co-op chaos, blending colorful visuals with over-the-top boss fights. Phantasy Star 4 brought deep sci-fi storytelling and turn-based RPG mechanics, often praised for its comic-style cutscenes. Shining Force stood out with grid-based tactical combat and a huge cast of characters to recruit and train. Castlevania Bloodlines reimagined the classic franchise with gory visuals and multiple characters, while Earthworm Jim combined surreal humor, slick animation, and tight shooting platforming gameplay. The enduring popularity of the Genesis has led to numerous re-releases and compilations of its games on modern platforms. These include Sonic Mega Collection and Sonic Gems Collection for PS2, Xbox, and GameCube, Sega Genesis Collection for PS2 and PSP, and Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Genesis games have also been made available for download on various digital platforms, including Nintendo's Virtual Console, Xbox Live Arcade, PlayStation Network, and Steam. In 2018, responding to the nostalgia-driven success of Nintendo's NES and SNES Classic Edition consoles, Sega announced the Genesis Mega Drive Mini. Released worldwide on September 19, 2019, this dedicated console includes 40 pre-installed games, different selections for different regions, and a Save Anywhere function. The menu music was composed by Streets of Rage composer Yuzo Koshiro, adding an authentic touch that resonated with longtime fans. Today, the Sega Genesis stands as more than just a successful gaming console. It represents a pivotal moment in video game history when competition, innovation, and bold marketing converged to forever change the industry. Thanks for joining me on this trip through the history of this legendary console. If there is any interesting gaming phenomena you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss more videos like this one. See you next time.